In October 1346, the King of Escotia crossed the border into the north of Inglaterra, convinced that he would find no resistance. With 12,000 men behind him, backed by an alliance forged in blood and betrayal, David II marched as his father would have marched, with certainty, with fire, with the shadow of the great Roberto Bruce looming over his steps. The Kingdom of Inglaterra was in Francia, besieging Calais. The north had been left exposed. It was the perfect moment. But what awaited in the hills west of Durham was not the void he had been promised. It was an army. It was 7,000 silent, organized, furious men, ready to prove that Inglaterra was never truly unprotected. And when the two armies met on the ridge, marked by an ancient stone cross, history took a turn that no one in Edinburgh had foreseen. Arrows fell in black arcs. Shields shattered under the rain of iron. Men screamed in Gaelic and in English, in prayer and in agony. The Scottish formations collapsed upon themselves. The field filled with smoke and dust and blood, and when the evening gave way to silence, a king lay wounded in the mud, captured by a simple English squire, with 2 arrowheads lodged in his face. When the sun of October 17th finished setting over Durham, Escotia had lost its king, and the echo of that defeat would resonate for 40 years. To understand why a Scottish monarch ended up as a prisoner in English lands, it is necessary to go back in time to the years when the medieval world revolved between 2 great wars and an ancient alliance that joined Paris with Edinburgh as if the Canal de la Mancha did not exist. It was the year 1346, and Europe lived under the weight of 2 simultaneous conflicts that fed each other with blood and strategy. On one side, the Guerra de los Cien Años between Inglaterra and Francia, which had already been turning northern Francia into a cemetery of knights for nearly a decade. On the other, the Segunda Guerra de Independencia Escocesa, the conflict that since 1332 pitted Escotia against Inglaterra in an endless series of battles, broken treaties, and borders that changed color on the maps of scribes. Edward III of Inglaterra was the center of gravity of both wars. A 34-year-old king who combined the patience of a strategist with the ferocity of a warrior, Edward had led his armies to the continent with undisguised ambition. In August 1346, his troops had crushed the French cavalry at Crécy, a victory so devastating that the Christian world was still searching for words to describe it. Now he was besieging Calais from the north, squeezing the city's neck with methodical and lethal determination. At that precise moment, when Inglaterra was focused on Francia, King Felipe VI of Francia invoked an agreement as old as the shared fear between 2 nations threatened by the same neighbor. The Antigua Alianza, the Old Alliance, the pact between Francia and Escocia, which established that if one was attacked by Inglaterra, the other would respond by opening a second front. Felipe needed no elaborate arguments. His words reached Edinburgh heavy with desperation. "I beg you, I implore you, do for me what I would do for you in this crisis." The situation was clear. If Escotia invaded northern Inglaterra, Edward would be forced to divide his forces. The siege of Calais would weaken, Francia would breathe, and Escotia, according to every calculation Edinburgh chose to make, would have a free hand because the English warriors were all in Francia. That was the fundamental assumption upon which the entire plan rested, and that assumption would prove to be the most catastrophic error of the campaign. David II of Escotia was 22 years old when he received the call from Francia. He was the son of Roberto I, the legendary Roberto Bruce, the man who had liberated Escotia from English domination at Bannockburn and whose figure followed him like an impossible shadow to overcome. Growing up as the son of a national hero is a singular burden. Everything David did was measured against the yardstick of his father. Every decision was judged in light of what the Bruce would have done. Every victory was too small, and every error too large. The young king had spent 7 years in exile in Francia, taking refuge in the castle of Chateau Gaillard, while his regents tried to keep the kingdom united in his name. He returned to Escotia in 1341 at 17 years old, to claim a throne surrounded by internal and external enemies. Edward Balliol, the rival backed by Edward III, continued to claim the Scottish crown with English support. The threat never entirely disappeared. In this context, the invitation from Philippe VI did not arrive merely as a duty of alliance. It came as an opportunity to prove he was worthy of his father, that he could lead armies to victory as the Bruce had done, that Escotia under his command was a power to be feared. His advisors and commanders encouraged him. His spies' reports painted northern Inglaterra as a region abandoned by its best warriors. The Archbishop of York had no army. The border garrisons were skeletons. Philippe VI himself had written to David describing the English north as a defenseless void, a space waiting to be taken. It was in this atmosphere of almost delusional certainty that David made the decision. On October 7, 1346, he crossed the border with an army of approximately 12,000 men. The invasion had begun. What David did not know was that Edward III had foreseen everything. Before sailing for Francia, the English king had left precise instructions for the defense of the north. He had not left the kingdom unprotected. He had entrusted the border to 3 men capable of improvising, organizing, and fighting: Lord Ralph Neville, one of the northern lords with the most military experience of his generation; Lord Henry Percy, heir to one of the most powerful families in Northumberland; and William Zouche, the Archbishop of York, a cleric who had no qualms about putting on armor if the situation required it. When news of the Scottish invasion reached their hands in August, the 3 began to act. Messengers departed for the northern counties. Calls to arms crossed Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Durham. An army took shape in Richmond, growing day by day while the Scots advanced south, looting whatever they found in their path. The Scots did not march in silence. They marched as large medieval armies usually did, with fire. Hexham Priory fell under their torches. The villages along their route of advance saw their harvests confiscated and their walls scorched. Corbridge burned. Rumors spread faster than the columns of smoke, sowing panic among the northern peasants who fled toward the cities with whatever they could carry. On October 16th, the Scots arrived at the gates of Durham. The city was a major prize. Its cathedral, built on rock atop a hill, embraced by the Rio Wear on 3 of its sides, was one of the most imposing monuments of medieval Christendom. The monks of the monastery offered to pay the Scottish army £1,000 in ransom to protect their foundation from looting, payable the following day. David accepted. He would stop to wait for the payment. It was that pause, that decision to stop and wait for money before continuing, that sealed the fate of the campaign. Because while the Scots waited for their payment on the outskirts of Durham, the English army was converging upon them from the north. Archbishop Zouche had gathered around 4,000 men from the northern counties, with another 3,000 Yorkshiremen marching to join the main column. Approximately 7,000 men in total, fewer than the Scots in number, but perfectly organized, well armed with the longbows that had devastated the French cavalry at Crécy just weeks before, and led by commanders who knew the terrain inch by inch. The morning of October 17th dawned cold and grey over Durham. The river mist mingled with the still lingering smoke from the looted villages. Scottish scouts sent word at dawn. An English army was approaching from the north along the road from Merrington. It was not a patrol. It was an organized fighting force. David II, awakened in his tent, received the news with a mixture of incredulity and disdain. According to the chronicles, he dismissed the threat almost with indifference. What he had been promised had been proven false in a matter of hours. The two armies took positions on the ridge west of Durham, on undulating and difficult terrain marked by ravines, stone fences, and the silhouette of an ancient Saxon cross that the locals called the Cruz de Neville, after the family that dominated those lands. The terrain did not favor the Scottish army. To advance against the English, the Scots would have to descend irregular slopes and cross areas of soft ground where their formation would lose cohesion. The more experienced Scottish commanders saw it immediately and recommended waiting, letting the English attack upward, forcing them to fight uphill. It was the right advice. The Scots hesitated. They formed 3 divisions on the ridge. The first, under the command of John Randolph, the Earl of Moray, perhaps the most capable commander Scotia had at that moment. The second in the center, commanded by King David himself. The third, on the right flank, under the orders of Robert Stewart, the king's nephew and heir presumptive to the crown. In front of them, the English also formed into 3 battalions, and when the Scots did not advance, the English took the initiative in the only way they knew how when the enemy wavered. They unleashed their archers. The English longbowmen were the most feared weapon of the 14th century. Veterans of the continent, men who had perfected their craft since childhood, firing arrows a meter long, with bows nearly 2 meters high, capable of firing 12 arrows per minute with devastating precision at more than 200 meters distance. The same bows that had cut down the French cavalry at Crécy like stalks before a scythe. The archers moved to the front and began to fire. Arrows fell upon the Scottish formations like hail. Men screamed, horses reared. A man's shield could stop an arrow. The shield of an entire formation was impossible. The pressure was unbearable. Then, instead of ordering a cavalry charge that would have dispersed the archers, David II made the decision that would define the outcome of the battle. He ordered all the infantry to advance. It was the wrong answer to the right challenge. The 1st Scottish Division under Randolph descended the irregular slopes and made contact with the English. The terrain forced them to twist their formation to the right, compressing it against the King's 2nd Division. Men crowded against one another. Cohesion dissolved. The English met them with spears, swords, and the incessant deluge of arrows that continued to fall from the flanks. John Randolph fell in that first onslaught, killed on the battlefield, the death of one of the best Scottish commanders. The 1st Division collapsed into the 2nd. In the chaos of men pushing and retreating, of orders that no one could hear, of steel clashing against steel in a confusion of dust and screams, the Scottish centre began to buckle. It was then that what no commander can forgive himself for occurred on the battlefield. The 3rd Division on the right flank, commanded by Robert Stewart, abandoned the position. Perhaps it was panic, perhaps it was calculation. Stewart was the heir presumptive, the man who would become king if David II died that day. There is no record to clarify what crossed his mind when he ordered the retreat. What the records do capture is the result. The 3rd Division withdrew from the battlefield, leaving the king exposed. David's right flank was left bare before the English. The army in the center, already pressed from the front, was now enveloped from the right. The formations dissolved into groups of men, fighting in isolation, without coordination, without the possibility of resisting the pressure coming from all angles. David II fought. Historical records state this without ambiguity. He did not flee immediately. He remained in the center of what was left of his battalion, fighting with his personal guards while the army around him disintegrated. He was the son of the Bruce. He would not abandon the field, but the field was abandoning him. An arrow pierced his cheek. The pain must have been brutal, but he kept fighting. A second arrow wounded his face. By then, barely 40 men were still defending the king, surrounded, exhausted, losing ground step by step. When he tried to withdraw, it was already too late to escape. Legend says that David II was found hiding under a bridge over a stream. that an English soldier saw his reflection in the water and discovered him. The story is vivid, almost too perfect to be completely true, and modern historians treat it with skepticism. It is more likely that the king was captured in combat during the pursuit that followed the collapse of his lines, when the English launched themselves after those who fled. What is certain is who captured him. It was not a great lord. It was not a famous general. It was John de Coupland, a squire of modest status, a man without a notable title, whose name would have disappeared into the anonymity of medieval history were it not for that unique moment. Coupland fought the wounded and battered king, subdued him, and led him as a prisoner off the battlefield. In doing so, he secured a fame and a reward that would transform his life. The king, with 2 arrowheads lodged in his face, was taken captive while the remnants of his army fled north, pursued by English riders. The pursuit was relentless. The English followed the fugitives for more than 30 kilometers, hunting men on the roads, in the woods, and at river crossings. Thousands of Scots died in the flight, more than on the battlefield itself. It was the pattern of medieval defeats. The greatest casualties did not occur during combat, but during the collapse, when men threw down their weapons and ran, and the pursuers had no reason to show mercy. Those who could pay ransom were taken prisoner. Those who could not died. Among the dead fell figures of the highest rank in the Scottish hierarchy: the constable, the marshal, the chamberlain, the chancellor, the earls of Moray and Strathearn, and Niall Bruce of Carrick, an illegitimate son of Roberto Bruce himself. Among the captured were 4 earls and William Douglas, the so-called Knight of Liddesdale, the most feared and effective guerrilla fighter Escotia had at that time. When night fell over the moor of Bear Park, west of Durham, Escotia had lost almost its entire military ruling class in a single day. In Durham Cathedral, the monks who had negotiated in vain for their ransom from looting listened in silence to the news arriving from the field. Prior John Fossa, who left one of the closest accounts of that day's events, wrote that the Scottish dead lay scattered across the moor, miserably exposed, and that English casualties had been few. It was the description of a total victory, one of those victories that leave no room for nuance, that offer the vanquished no consolation of having fought well or having been close. The Scots had been crushed. Their king was a prisoner. The north of Inglaterra was silent. Philippe II's promise that the English were not there and that the path was clear had turned out to be, at best, a monumental miscalculation, and at worst, a convenient lie that Francia needed Escotia to believe. David II was moved south, with his wounds unhealed and his humiliation unprocessed. Accounts speak of a man who alternated between bitterness and disbelief during the first days of his captivity. He had crossed the border as the son of the Bruce, the heir to a legend, a king who was going to prove that Escotia had never stopped being dangerous. He would return eventually as a man who had spent 11 years as an involuntary guest of the English crown. They held him first at the castle of Odium in Hampshire, a fortress of water and stone in the southern marshes that could not have been further from the winds of the Tierras Altas. There he would remain for years while 2 kingdoms negotiated his price. Edward III was in no hurry. A captured king was an extraordinarily useful tool. He offered him freedom on 3 different occasions, each time with the same condition, that David accept one of Edward's sons as heir to the Scottish throne, uniting the 2 crowns under the Plantagenet dynasty. It was a demand that, had it been accepted, would have erased Escotia as an independent political entity. The Scottish Parliament rejected the proposal all 3 times. In Edinburgh, regents and nobles governed in the name of an absent king, navigating the kingdom's politics with the permanent awareness that their monarch was in the hands of the enemy. Robert Stewart, the same man who had fled the battlefield leaving his uncle exposed, governed as regent with an effectiveness that historians have debated for centuries. That he benefited from the king's absence did not make him the architect of his capture, but the memory of that third division withdrawing never completely left the memory of those who survived the battle. It was not until 1357, 11 years after the disaster on the outskirts of Durham, that David II finally returned to Escocia. The price of his freedom was the Tratado de Berwick, 100,000 marks in ransom, to be paid in annual installments over 10 years, and during that period no Scottish subject could take up arms against Edward III or his men. The sum was astronomical for Scottish finances. It would be equivalent in modern terms to tens of millions of pounds, a burden that crushed the kingdom's economy for decades. The taxes necessary to raise the payments generated popular resentment. The deadlines were not always met. The financial debt from the Battle of the Creuse de Neville accompanied Escocia long after David II died in 1371 without leaving heirs. Robert Stuart, his nephew and regent, succeeded him on the throne as Roberto II, founding the Estuardo dynasty that would rule Escocia and eventually all of Gran Bretagna. It was the final irony of a story that began with a man trying to prove he was worthy of his father. Strategically, the Battle of the Creuse de Neville freed Inglaterra from the threat of a second front in the north exactly at the moment it needed it most. With Escocia paralyzed and its king a prisoner, Edward III was able to concentrate all his resources on the continent. The siege of Calais continued without interruption. The city fell in August 1347. The English victory in Francia, which began in the fields of Crécy in August, was consolidated in part thanks to what happened in October in the hills of Durham. The two battles, separated by a channel and by weeks of time, reinforced each other in ways that no planner could have foreseen with precision. The truce that followed David II's release brought 4 decades of relative peace to the Anglo-Scottish border. 40 years in which the villages of northern Inglaterra did not burn from Scottish raids. 40 years in which the peasants of the border counties could farm without the shadow of the northern riders. It was the peace of the exhausted, the peace that is born not of reconciliation, but of the inability to continue the war. And yet it worked. It kept the border silent for 4 decades. A notable achievement in a region where violence was almost climatic. The name of the battle became linked to Lord Ralph Neville, whose family dominated the lands where it was fought. The ancient Saxon stone cross that marked the territorial boundary on that ridge gave its name to the clash. Neville ordered a replacement cross built to commemorate the victory. That cross was destroyed in 1589 during the turbulent times of the Reformation. The site still exists west of Durham, marked by fragments of the original monolith and by a modest sign that visitors sometimes discover almost by accident, as if the battlefield preferred anonymity to glory. There is something in the story of the Creuse de Neville that resists heroic simplification. It is not the story of a brave defender against a powerful invader. It is not the story of the small overcoming the large. It is the story of an intelligence error that turned into a disaster, of a young king who believed what he wanted to believe, of an alliance that worked for Francia and proved catastrophic for Escocia. David II was no coward. He fought while wounded when he could have fled sooner. But personal bravery is not enough when tactical decisions are wrong, when the terrain works against you, and when you trust allies who have given you information that served their interests more than your own. Philippe VI of Francia was never captured. He never paid a ransom. He never spent 11 years in a foreign castle contemplating the cost of his decisions. David II did. Every aspect of his captivity was a direct consequence of that message from Paris describing northern Inglaterra as a defenseless void. The men who died, scattered across the moor of Bear Park, were evidence of how much that incorrect description weighed. And yet, in the complexity of long-term consequences, the Scottish defeat at the Creuse de Neville did not destroy the independence of Escocia. On the contrary, it preserved it in an unexpected way. Edward III offered to free David in exchange for his acceptance of an English successor. Escocia said no 3 times. It spent resources it did not have, indebted future generations, governed with an absent king for 11 years, and said no. That refusal, repeated with an obstinacy bordering on the irrational, was in itself an affirmation of national existence. Escocia preferred to pay an impossible price rather than surrender its crown to a foreign family. The battlefield was lost that October of 1346. Independence was not. The story of the Creuse de Neville is, ultimately, the story of a nation that learned the price of confusing desire with reality, that paid that price for decades, and that survived regardless. The ancient stone cross that gave the battle its name remained standing on that ridge above Durham for centuries after the last soldiers departed. Pilgrims passing on the road toward the shrine of San Cuthberto in the cathedral saw it at sunset, silhouetted against the northern sky. A border marked in stone, a frozen moment where 2 kingdoms measured their strength and one of them paid with its king. And in that stone, in that silence that follows the noise of great battles, is engraved the most enduring truth of that October. That the errors of kings are paid for by the people, that alliances have a price, and that history does not distinguish between the son of a hero and any other man when the arrows begin to fall.